Hello Penguinauts, I'm the Beardy Penguin and welcome back to For All Kerbalkind. We begin the episode by finishing our research on crew survivability, which finally allows us to add supplementary oxygen to our aircraft. So we've refitted our KPNK2 weather plane, and Raphael is launching from Plesetsk. Now, the operational range of the aircraft is actually limited by Raphael's suit CO2 scrubber, which only has a lifetime of 8 hours. So we've pretty much optimized the aircraft for that flight time, so essentially giving it just a little bit more than 8 hours worth of fuel and 8 hours worth of supplementary oxygen, because of course he is going to be flying all the way up on the edge of space. Well, 20 kilometers, but apparently that's high up enough for newspapers to claim it's the edge of space when someone wearing a Red Bull jumper leaps from a balloon at that height, apparently. Anyway, we've actually got quite an ambitious flight plan ahead of us. It's going to take us, you guessed it, 8 hours, which thankfully we have 4 times time accelerate, but yeah, this still took 2 hours, so I actually did it over the course of a couple of different play sessions. I was actually playing Among Us tabbed out with some of my friends while this aircraft was flying. I kept getting killed while I wasn't looking. Yeah, because I was flying an aircraft in a different game. The joys of having 2 monitors, though. So, what we're going to do is fly all the way over Eastern Europe, our friendly satellite states, and all the way over to Berlin. Because for some reason, Nikita Kerman is planning some large new piece of infrastructure along the divide between the east and western halves of the city. So he'd like some aerial photography to plan out his new playgrounds that he's planning to implement to, you know, encourage the children from both sides to work together towards the common good of humanity. And then we're going to head south a little bit over Czechoslovakia, Austria and the like, and then we're going to swing by Budapest in Hungary, because 2 years ago they had a little bit of a kerfuffle and Nikita Kerman had to send some tanks over just to reassure them that we were looking out for them, you know, friendly Soviet overlords, just letting you know that we're there. So Raphael, of course, is at the helm once again, as you remember, he did transfer out of the HAR program, but he hasn't actually had anything to do for quite a long time. It took far too long, not only to actually research crew survivability, but to actually refit this aircraft. Though you notice it's in a nice, sexy new black color scheme, which I think suits it a lot better. You'll see Berlin below us in all of its glory, though, and we are actually activating our planetary photography. We're flying over 2 new biomes, actually. We're flying over the forests biome and the mountain biome, because now we've flown over Berlin, we're going to head south. We're not going to directly cross into Western Europe. We're just going to do a border flight, mainly because, well, in the time it took to refit this aircraft and actually get it working, those pesky Americans have developed an aircraft potentially capable of intercepting it. Yes, a K-100. We've received detailed schematics of it from our operatives in the West, and it seems it could, if it climbed into a almost vertical ascent, almost reach us with its weapons before it stalled. So it's not an opportunity we want to present them, not a chance that Nikita Kerman is willing to take. So unfortunately, the problems we had with this aircraft kind of, well, ruined any advantage we might have got from it by getting it out early. Regardless, though, we're still able to fly over friendly airspace and sort of tease NATO and fly along the border just to check if there's, you know, any kind of build-up forming. But thankfully, all seems quiet on the Western Front, and we fly over Budapest, just keeping an eye on the tank columns we currently have lined up around the city. Just make sure they're all doing okay, getting along nice and jolly with the citizens of the city. So now we've continued over Budapest, we can fly all the way back to Plesetsk, and, well, this was a very, very long and rather boring flight, most of which I wasn't even paying attention for, so we're going to cut most of it out. And finally, we're beginning our approach down to the runway, cutting our engine and beginning a nice slow glide. We actually burnt through so much of our fuel we had to rebalance the aircraft slightly, but this is a beautifully beautifully stable plane. You can see that all those flight mechanics and aerodynamics modules that I do on my course are actually beginning to help me out. Not in reality, but in a flight simulating video game. But you know, yeah, it still counts, right? Yeah, I think so. Speaking of my course, I've had a lot of coursework over the past 2 weeks. I wasn't even sure I was going to be able to get this episode up on time. I've already had loads of comments like, "It's Sunday, Beardy, where's my episode, ree?" But you know, it is here. It's just a little later in the day because I had to do pretty much all of the editing on this video and everything all today because yeah, I've been drowning in coursework because, you know, everything's online. Let's increase engagement by giving everyone 3 assignments a week. Anyway, moving swiftly on, this is Lune 2. Yes, we're going to make a second attempt to send a probe to the moon after Lune 1 rather spectacularly exploded on the launch pad last year. And this is a much more capable vehicle because it's using our newly researched RD-0105 vacuum optimized engine, and that is going to be performing our translunar injection. So the R10 here is going to lift the entire upper stage into orbit, and then we can wait until we orbit around to the other side of the planet, perform our translunar injection using the RD-0105, and then we finally have our ORM-65 engine just to perform our final orbital insertion. Now, we are well ahead of those Amerikanskis. They have launched, of course, a lunar impact probe, but they haven't got anything into orbit yet. So if Lune 2 is successful, we will be the first to achieve lunar orbit. I think we actually have more powerful rockets than they do. I think them completing that lunar impact probe mission was kind of akin to us getting the first satellite into orbit. You know, they managed it first, which is obviously very, very important, but they didn't really do it in a very sustainable manner, right? They designed a vehicle which managed to pull it off, but, you know, it's a bit hit or miss whether or not it would be able to reliably complete that mission again. I think they're focusing on different things this year. We've noticed a lot of very short-term missions flying over the Soviet Union. I don't know what they're working on, but regardless, their launching of communication, weather satellites seems to have ceased this year. As I said, they're not being all that active, so perhaps we'll have to send a few more operatives over to infiltrate the Astral Foundation, you know, a few more willing engineers with convincing American accents. Regardless, though, we've plotted our maneuver node and we are ready to start our translunar injection. Mind, though, that this is the first time we are using the RD-0105, so it's not guaranteed it's actually even going to ignite. I believe I had a 10% chance of ignition failure. Thankfully, though, the full burn failure chance isn't too much of a threat, mainly considering this has a rated burn time of 440 seconds, and we're not going to be burning it for anywhere near that long. Regardless, though, the engine thankfully ignites without any problems, and we are on our way to the moon. I'm really happy with how this probe turned out and how this whole mission actually worked out. Really, this engine is going to open up space to us in a whole new way. Having a vacuum optimized engine gives us so much more delta V. It's even going to allow the R8 to lift much, much heavier payloads into orbit and pretty much give that launch vehicle a new lease of life. You can see there just using our reaction control systems to tweak our encounter, and we are headed off into deep space. This is quite a pioneering mission for a lot of reasons, actually. We're also using deep space avionics for the first time, which is a special kind of avionics which are very expensive but can actually turn themselves off, go into a hibernation mode to save power while you're time warping and while you're not actually performing maneuvers, which of course is pretty critical for keeping mass down and obviously not having a huge number of batteries or solar panels, so allowing us to get larger probes into lunar orbit and actually opening up interplanetary missions to us, although we are going to need much more powerful antennas and communication systems before we can do that, and that's not really in our priority queue for research at the moment. We're really rushing to try and get basic capsules ahead of the Americans so we can get the first Kerbal into orbit, but that is something to worry about next year. For now, though, we have finally managed to get a space probe into orbit of the moon, and we get an absolute bounty of science, not only from space low and high around the moon, but also from space high around the Earth. We hadn't actually sent a space probe this far out anywhere near the moon before, so this is a monumental achievement, and we're going to be researching a lot of new techs. Early human spaceflight material science, basic capsules, 1959 orbital rocketry, and later on we get a little bit more science from the probe and we begin researching 1960 orbital rocketry. So what we're going to do is just grab even more flyby and orbit contracts for the moon and use all of that money that we just got. Yeah, we got over 1 million funds there from advance payments and the payments from completing those contracts. And we're going to invest all of them into Baikonur and Plesetsk. Yeah, we're going to make these launch sites the envy of the world. And we're just going to keep launching more and more lunar missions throughout this episode because they're so lucrative and we can repeat them all at least 2 or 3 times. In the meantime, though, we're going to launch another flight of the Pulya. And you'll notice we actually have a new cosmonaut at the helm. His name is Yuri Kerman. I know quite a few of you can probably guess what his destiny is, judging from his name. But just for now, he is going to be flying the Pulya, doing a supersonic contract, and then once he's completed that, flying up to 130 kilometers to complete a second X-Planes high contract, as well as that supersonic one. So actually getting us quite a bit of funding, and really quite an ambitious mission for his first flight, but Yuri performs exceptionally. He's actually going higher and faster than any of his cosmonaut comrades before him, but he manages it with ease. Clearly a hotshot destined for great things. That's, you know, as I said, if the Americans don't beat us into orbit. But I'm really very confident with how many lunar contracts we're now completing, and we now have a reliable, you know, launch system to send probes to the moon. I'm thinking we're going to be able to invest a lot of money into our space program. Regardless, though, at 130 kilometers, we are right on the edge of where the atmosphere actually stops. Now, though space officially starts at the Kármán line, which is 100 kilometers, there's still quite a bit of atmospheric drag at that altitude. So Realism Overhaul models the atmosphere ending at 140 kilometers. So until we get to that altitude, we can't get crude science from space around the Earth. So that's really the main goal we're going for. But we decided to actually increase the altitude we take the HAR-4 to in pretty small increments. I don't want to increase it all the way up to 140 kilometers and then have the craft disintegrate on re-entry. So Yuri still managing a very, very impressive flight, but still not quite taking it above that 140 kilometer mark. Although he's now proven that he's able to do it absolutely unscathed. So we will attempt it on our next flight of the HAR-4. And recovery crews find him very jubilant, not managing to get all the way to the space center, but still landing remarkably close for his first flight. However, we've just researched early flight control. As well as giving us access to hydrazine, we also now get access to smart ASS thanks to MechJeb. So now we're actually going to have much finer control over our spacecraft. No more will the SAS massively overcorrect and cause all sorts of crazy oscillations and the like. This is something N9 basically begged me to allow him to use, so we decided to lock it behind a tech node, and now we are using smart ASS, so our flight profiles are going to look a lot more natural than the slightly more janky stock SAS flight profiles that we have been seeing. So what are we looking at here? Well, this is an R8 launching from Plesetsk, carrying a very important payload. Now, a lot of people in the previous episode commented saying, yeah, but of course Pogoda 1 is a weather satellite, wink wink. A lot of them not realizing you have to launch at least one legitimate weather satellite for the Yanks to buy your cover story, right? This is Pogoda 2, and it is our first actual spy satellite. Yes, Pogoda 2. It's a rather harmless name. It's clearly just another weather satellite we're launching. Ha 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 ha, fools. Now, it's not a long-term spy satellite. We have access to basically the cameras that we used on the Corona satellites. Obviously not a very not a very good name considering the current world situation. But regardless, we do have access to those cameras, but those experiments take a long time to run. They require multiple satellites to be launched over the course of a few years. So I thought we would test the actual concept of using spy satellites. As I said, the Yanks have managed to develop the F-100, which is probably capable of intercepting the GLAS aircraft. So we need to think of novel new ways of spying on the US, and this certainly seems to be a capable way of doing it. We actually launched into a slightly retrograde orbit, which means we end up flying over the continental United States within 30 minutes of launch. So we're getting very fast intel, although we need to actually return our samples back to the ground before we can process the film and actually see what we've managed to take photographs of. Although we have managed to pass over both of the major Astral Foundation launch sites, so we can get a little bit more insight as to what they're working on, what they've got on the launch pad. And it seems they're working on a new launch vehicle over in Wallops, something that uses almost entirely solid rocket boosters, it seems. Well, I wish them the best with that. I'm sure that won't explode. Anyway, so after spending 24 hours in orbit, we're going to return the sample canister back to the Earth. Now, of course, the RD-0105 doesn't have more than one ignition, so we have to deorbit ourselves using the reaction control systems, but thankfully we carried more than enough nitrous oxide to do just that. So we get ourselves on a trajectory which is going to pass over the Soviet Union, and we detach our sample capsule, being very careful not to land anything in the United States. Not only would this obviously deeply incriminate us, it would also give all of the scientific data to the Americans. So yeah, I'm not sure how much science they would actually get from spy satellite photos of their own nation, but apparently that's how things work in this universe, so we're just not going to question it. Regardless though, the mission is an unmitigated success, and the sample capsule lands unscathed in Siberia, managing to recover it and get about 11 points of science, which is certainly nothing to sniff at. But next time we launch a spy satellite, it will be a more long-term one. Regardless though, we're going to use the money we actually got from completing a orbital sample return to unlock balloon tanks and research digital communications, which will be useful in the days to come. But in the meantime, we're going to launch yet another lunar orbiter. This is Luna 3. It's carrying some more long-term scientific instruments, a Geiger-Müller counter, a micrometeorite detector, and that massive magnetometer boom, which are going to complete their experiments over the course of 90 days or so. Luna 2 only carried some very basic scientific instruments just to keep the power consumption and the mass down. Just didn't want to take any chances really with our first lunar orbiter, but now I think we can take some more chances and push our delta V margins a little bit. Watching that beautiful separation of the boosters there, not quite a Korolev cross just yet. We need 2 more boosters for that, so we're gonna have to wait until we have access to a 350-ton launch pad there. But regardless, the R10 is actually turning into a very reliable launch vehicle now that the side boosters aren't exploding on launch. You can see there we have a successful separation and the start of the second stage engine. Now, it actually turns out that the RD-0105 engine has more than enough performance on the R8 to actually send something out to lunar orbit. So that's actually what we're going to get working on at Plesetsk. So it turns out that, yeah, the R10 is a little bit overbuilt for lunar missions, but I decided that I was actually going to take advantage of that since we were already obviously building Luna 3. So I decided that since we're actually launching the whole upper stage off towards the moon, and then of course detaching the final space probe for the lunar orbit insertion, we might as well be using that final stage there as an impact probe, and that way we can complete not only the flyby and the orbiter contracts but also the impact contract all in one mission. So that's why that upper stage there with the RD-0105 actually has antennas on it, because it's going to adjust its own trajectory after we've completed the translunar injection to impact the moon and actually complete all 3 contracts in one go, giving us an absolute landslide of funding, which is going to propel our space program forward in a giant leap. That, of course, is the intention. In reality, things, well, let's just say don't go entirely to plan. We actually lose communications with the space probe because I didn't keep an eye on the location of our ground stations, and that means we actually overburn by 80 meters per second. Unfortunately, our final engine only has one ignition, and we don't quite have enough reaction control fuel to decelerate by 80 meters per second. Now, it actually turns out that the ORM-65 we've been using as our final stage engine on all of our space probes pretty much, yeah, it has another config that I didn't notice, the RDA 1150. And not only does it have a higher thrust to weight ratio, much higher reliability as well, it also has a second ignition. Yeah, I was feeling pretty stupid around about now. If we had used the RDA 1150 config for our final engine, we would have been able to perform a small burn here to decelerate and bring our periapsis close to the moon, and then a final burn to circularize into orbit around the moon. But as it stands, yeah, we only have one ignition. So it turns out that, yeah, we pretty much have to burn our engine and just go for the flyby. Because unfortunately, if we continue on our current trajectory, well, we're not even going to complete the flyby contract. Unfortunately, with the orientation of the spacecraft, since we now actually can't control that, we decoupled our avionics, we can't actually get the impact contract either. So we're just going to be getting a flyby with this mission, unfortunately. A little bit disappointing, but regardless, you know, it's not a completely bust mission. We still managed to get a lunar flyby, and we get a reasonable amount of scientific data from our instruments. Although it does turn out that we don't actually have enough power coming in through those solar panels to run our instruments and transmit the data at the same time. So I have to sort of shut them down periodically. But once we get close to the moon, I decide to activate them, get as much data as we physically can, and then get transmitting it in a giant burst before we fly off into solar orbit and then go out of communications range. Because yeah, our comm systems are being really stretched at this point. We can only just communicate with probes out to the moon, so heading out into solar orbit, unfortunately we are going to lose contact with Luna 3, and it is going to turn into a piece of space junk. But as I said, we managed to complete the lunar flyby contract, so we still get a reasonable amount of funding from that mission. But while we wait for another orbiter to be constructed, we're blasting Vladimir up on the Ha-4, and this time we're going to break the 140 kilometer mark. Yes, we're going to fly all the way up to 146 kilometers and get ourselves some science from space around the Earth. Now this is the highest that we have ever gone, and we're pushing the Puglia all the way to its limits. We're making sure that we're going as high as we can while still keeping a little bit of fuel to do our all-important retrograde burn before we enter the atmosphere, just to make sure that we don't burn up and, well, disintegrate the spacecraft, which of course would be a very early and premature retirement for Vladimir. Speaking of which, actually, the Kerbals do actually retire in Realism Overhaul, and Vladimir's retirement is rapidly approaching, which is why I decided to hire Yuri as well as Valentina, because I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get into orbit before he retires, but it would certainly be something if we do manage to get him all the way up into orbit. But regardless, he has a nice successful flight, and we managed to get Earth photography and a crew report from space around the Earth. So this is what I was talking about earlier. We can actually launch something on a translunar trajectory with the R8, with the RD-0105 as an upper stage. However, it has a few complications. Now, since the RD-0105 only has a single ignition, we have to actually combine our orbital insertion and our translunar injection into one burn. The R8 does not have enough delta V to put that entire upper stage into orbit and then orbit around to the ascending node, etc. We're also launching from Plesetsk, and that introduces some complications because we're at a really, really high latitude. So what I decided to go with is essentially wait until the moon is approaching its lowest point in its orbit relative to the Earth, and we're launching south from Plesetsk, so into a polar orbit heading south, and we're essentially going to burn straight into the most eccentric orbit that we can actually manage, all in one burn from that RD-0105 engine. And then we're going to use our final stage, that RDA 1150 config, now actually making use of that config for the RM65, and that will push us onto a final impact trajectory with the moon. Now I found out that since we have a second ignition on the RDA 1150, we actually had enough delta V here to go into lunar orbit, but we accepted our lunar impact contract quite a while ago, and this is actually the last chance we have to complete it before it expires. So unfortunately we didn't go into lunar orbit. I'm sure some of you might be wondering why I didn't deorbit Luna 2 to complete the lunar impact contract, and it's actually because the contract requires an impact at quite a high velocity, and I think it's been selected specifically so that you can't deorbit something which is in orbit of the moon and impact with enough velocity. You have to be on a translunar trajectory to impact the moon with enough velocity to actually complete the contract. So unfortunately we can't just cheat and deorbit Luna 2 as much as I would like to do that. Apologies if you couldn't see much during the launch there, but we have to launch at the optimum time, and yeah, that turned out in this case to be in the dark. So I think roughly half of our launches are going to end up being in the dark. I did boost the ambient light as much as I could without making things look weird, but unfortunately KSP, especially with all the visual mods, is a little bit dark around the dark side of planetary bodies. But regardless, I hope you could see things well enough. And we are now actually facing the sun, and you can see Luna 4 in all of its adorable little glory. Isn't it cute? As I said, yeah, we could have actually got into lunar orbit here, although I guess we would have needed some way to reorient the spacecraft, since I don't think Luna 4 would have been pointing the correct way. So maybe we couldn't have got into lunar orbit. I don't know. Regardless, we had quite a bit of delta V left over and another engine ignition, so it did make me kind of sad, thinking, maybe we could have had another lunar orbiter launched on an R8 rocket. But regardless, we have an absolutely flawless lunar impact mission, and we have launched our very first lunar impact probe and our very first lunar mission from Plesetsk. Honestly, I'm quite proud of myself for managing to figure out a way to launch to the moon at all from such a high latitude launch site. And as I said, with only one ignition on our upper stage engine, launching into this orbit though, which means we get a really gorgeous view of the South Pole there and the Aurora Australis as we head off into deep space for our date with the moon. We are quite literally going to bonk the moon. Something, as I said, the Americans did actually achieve and have also achieved once more this year. So something that they're getting relatively proficient at, although they still haven't got anything into orbit. So I think we're still well ahead. You can see there we get quite a bit of funding and even a fair chunk of science as a nice reward for that. So now, while we're waiting for our next lunar orbiter to be constructed at Baikonur, we're going to accept the 170-kilometer suborbital flight contract as well as a new impactor contract, using the advance payment to get working on a 350-ton launch pad, which we're going to need next year to actually launch crew into orbit. Yes, that's what we're going to be working towards in the next episode. I'm really very, very excited. But in the meantime, we're going to have to make do with suborbital flights. So we're launching Valentina higher than ever before. I mean, every flight we're launching is going higher than the previous one, but this one really is quite a leap. You'll see we mounted some massive air brakes onto the back of the Ha-4 because this time we're going all the way up to 170 kilometers. Spending as much time in space as we can to try and get as much scientific data, so as much time for Valentina to float over to the window and take pretty pictures of the Earth as she can. And once again, we do save a little bit of fuel for the retrograde burn, but really those air brakes are what basically the crucial ingredient we needed to slow us down enough so that we don't disintegrate here. And we're actually not completing an X-plane contract here, we're completing the suborbital flight contract, which is a fair bit more lucrative. So really quite a momentous achievement. I'm honestly quite surprised that the spacecraft managed to survive this. I think we could go all the way up to 180 kilometers, perhaps even 200. We've gone so high this episode now. We've We've actually run out of altitude milestones for the HAL-4 to achieve. We're just completing suborbital flight contracts now, which is really rather incredible. So we've reached pretty much the limit of what the HAL-4 can achieve, and we're pretty much ready to be going into orbit in the next episode. But before we do that, we have the final launch of 1958. This is Luna 5, and this is our second attempt to launch a long-term scientific satellite into orbit around the moon. R10 performing beautifully as it has throughout this entire episode. We only actually had one, I guess, minor engine failure in this episode, which was a performance loss on the second stage engine of the launch of Pogoda 2. So really, we've been very, very lucky this episode, although I guess maybe luck doesn't actually have anything to do with it, because we've been using the same launch vehicles over and over, and the same engines, getting loads and loads of engine data, and really working on making our existing launch vehicles as reliable as possible. I think that booster explosion in the previous episode, although that set us back by months, really gave us a lot of engine data. I think major failures like that, especially a transient failure within 1 second of firing the engine, gives you a lot of data. You know, watching things explode teaches you a lot, I guess. So now, really, our launch vehicles are becoming really, really reliable. I don't see any reason why we should really change that. We're just going to keep upgrading the engines, just keep stretching the tanks, adding more boosters, and keep iterating upon our designs. That's really the Soviet philosophy that we're using here, and it really works with Realism Overhaul, what with tooling costs and engine reliability as factors. It's really a very, very viable philosophy to be implementing. Regardless, though, this time we actually plot a maneuver which will stay within range of a ground station, so we won't lose control of the probe during our translunar injection, and we get ourselves heading on a beautiful trajectory straight and true towards the moon. Although this time, if we needed to, we are actually using the RDA1150 config for the ORM65, so we could have actually decelerated a little bit if we needed to. But regardless, there is no such need, and we can actually complete the Lunar Impact contract as well. That thing that we really wanted to attempt with Luna 3, but this time, since we didn't bungle our translunar injection, we can actually do it. So we're going to spin up and release the actual Luna 5 orbiter, and that is obviously on the maneuver node, which is going to complete to get into orbit around the moon. Then we can get rid of that spin and then deorbit this transfer stage. It only has a little bit of reaction control fuel, but that is just enough to bring the periapsis into the surface of the moon, and it's going to impact about 5 minutes before the circularization burn of the main orbiter. So we're completing the lunar orbit contract and the lunar impact contract. We actually completed all the flyby contracts. There were only 2 of those, but there were 2 orbiter contracts, and there are also 3 lunar impactor contracts. So we need to do 1 more impactor in the next episode, but we'll just launch that from Plesetsk, akin to the way we launched Luna 4 earlier in this year. Regardless, though, the RDA 1150 fires, and we enter into a beautiful orbit. Not a circular orbit, but that's actually beneficial because we want to get scientific data from low around the moon and from high around the moon over the next 90 days or so. Although the space probe, doesn't quite have enough power to transmit and do scientific reading, so it's gonna sort of be giving us data in dribs and drabs over the course of probably a few months. But regardless, the solar panels should last long enough for us to get all of the data we need. Regardless, though, we get a lot of funding from that, and we have invested very heavily in Baikonur, so we should be able to build a crewed vessel in the next episode to head into orbit of the Earth. Regardless, though, the Americans are hot on our heels. It seems, though, that, they haven't been quite as successful as us this year. It seems Pathfinder 3 kind of stalled in orbit. We managed to decrypt its telemetry, and it seems it was planning a translunar injection, but tripped at the goal line there. So just a little bit of a flex there over our American rivals. Regardless, though, that is the end of the episode, and as I said, the Americans are hot on our heels, so we can't rest on our laurels. We really need to race to get Yuri up into orbit ahead of the Americans next year. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. I do hope you've enjoyed. I've been the Beardy Penguin, and I will see you all next time.